One German scholar was attacked by his country's media for publishing his findings about Xinjiang. What was his story? My exclusive interview with Georg Gesk, professor of Chinese law at Osnabrück University in Germany. And why is Xinjiang strategically important to the U.S.? My colleague Jamie Wright spoke with renowned author and journalist Vijay Prashad. Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Xinjiang through the eyes of a German law professor who happens to speak excellent Chinese. Professor Georg Gesk first came to China in 1986, and over the past 40 years, he's become a real China expert, not the kind that you see on BBC or Fox News. He's fluent in Chinese and has closely followed the evolution of China's legal system since reform and opening up. He recently made headlines, however, in Germany after writing a book based on his research trip to Xinjiang with 4 fellow German scholars. He was attacked in a 6-page long article published in a leading German newspaper which accused him of doing the Chinese government's bidding. Despite these attacks, Professor Gesk refuses to be silenced, and he joined me for the very first time to talk about his story. Here was my conversation with Georg Gesk, professor of Chinese law at Osnabrück University in Germany. In 2023, you and 4 other German scholars went on a trip to Xinjiang. You spent a couple of days and you met top officials, as well as, you visited different sites, you did your discussion and so on and so forth. How did that visit come about, and what did you see during that trip? Can you recall some of the most memorable moments or people or experience you had during that trip?
Well, as far as I can remember, Thomas Heberer, one of our group, did talk to the consulate general probably, or at least somebody from the consulate in Düsseldorf, and said, well, maybe go to Xinjiang and just look for ourselves what's going on. So maybe the whole discussion could be more substantial and not so confrontational. Mm-hmm. And the consulate was very supportive and said, yes, that's a good idea, we will support you. So he had some friends, and friends asked other friends. So in the end, we ended up with 12 people on a list who said, okay, we might be interested in going there. Then some dropped out again because one is vice president of a university, and others said, oh, you cannot do this because in case there is a shitstorm, we cannot do it. You cannot go there. So some people opted out, but at least 6 went on the trip, and we did some field research. First, it was not easy to convince people that this is a good idea. I remember that at one point, people said, no, the authorities in Xinjiang are not very supportive. I guess they saw we had the average age of our group was rather high. They were concerned for our health. And as it turned out, one got COVID in Beijing, so she couldn't come to Xinjiang with us. And one got COVID in Xinjiang, so at some time he had to stay in the hotel room and was attended for by a nurse. So it was really to see that people are concerned. Oh, these people are mostly elder. There might be some risk. Yes, there was some risk, but luckily nothing really serious happened. And they all got attended by professional personnel, so everybody went home safely and is in good health until now.
Yeah. In terms of academic research, your academic interests, what would you say is the biggest takeaway from this trip for you?
For me, it was a very interesting experience to be at the regional People's Congress and to talk with people with very important, very different representatives of the judiciary and the legislature, and to have a real dialogue. First, they gave us an introduction into their point of view, and then we had been able to ask. And as a legal scholar, this was, for me, this was one of the most informative talks. But there had been other things like sometimes it's a very small episode. You see, we had been at factory, and then we went to some schools and so on. At one school where people had professional training, we went back to our bus, and it was only 5 minutes small talk. But I told them, well, I've been dean in Taiwan, and I had some students who had been drug addicts, and I knew that, and I know I have to keep them secret. I can't just tell others, oh, look at these, they're nasty guys. But I cannot ignore this, so I have to have some kind of precautions. And I said, well, from that kind of experience, I'm very interested in how do they deal when they know that a student might be, at some stage in his development, being involved with extremist thoughts. Because you have a similar situation. You cannot throw them out, and you shouldn't single them out, otherwise they will have a branding. And in kind of, when you read criminology, you will say, when you have young people and they have some branding, I'm a terrorist. Yes, then I will show you that I'm a terrorist. You cannot do so. So you have to integrate them, and still you have to have an eye upon them. And when you, with my experience, I saw that they immediately understood what I was talking about and said, yes, we are the same. We have to integrate them into the classes and so on, but we still have to have an eye on them. So for me, this was a very, very instructive 5-minute small talk, because it addressed a real problem without any pretense, we have to do this in academic terms, or we have to do this. It was just experience to experience, me as a teacher to them as a teacher, and vice versa. And I think this is a very, very important experience, that you see you can talk to people very freely, because I am open and I tell them I had this problem, and it was a real serious problem, and we dealt with it like this, and then to see that people say, yes, we have some similar problem. So these were really, really good points.
In terms of the laws and the regulations in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, I'm coming back to your academic work. Have you done some research on, for instance, the legislation process or the kind of laws that are being churned out in the autonomous region? And what do people outside of China, for those who do not understand the situation, who probably are interested in finding out how law is enacted and how it's enforced, what would you like to tell them as to how unique Xinjiang probably is as part of China, but it has still its own logic in terms of how things are done in certain ways at certain stages?
You see that the rules and the reality of society are moving, and you are willing to explore how to put things in rules, so that reality evolves together with rules, and is improved. So to see, okay, where is the problem? So we try to have rules in order to cope with the problem. Then we see, oh, there are routes of a problem. So what rules do we need in order to come to the roots of the problem? And therefore, things are in a constantly evolving, and this is a very good thing to see, that you don't have something and that fits for all and forever. But you say, since society is evolving, since the problem is evolving, our answer to these things has to evolve, but it is not evolving just in a vacuum, but we want to be a legal, want to have a legal basis for that, and we want to have basis in criminology or in psychology to that. So how can we improve that people say don't have to take a gun in order to have a professional perspective? At some time in Afghanistan, people would say people had to go to the Taliban in order to have a perspective, because when you're a fighter, you're a respected person. And apart from that, there was no perspective. So when you have Xinjiang in comparison, you see, okay, to have social development, to think about how do I get people into work? So they have a different perspective. I don't have to have a gun in order to have a profession. These are things that are not limited to criminal law, but they are a whole social development program. And to see that this social development program is pushed and is put to the ground, and that it finds roots, and that people get involved and find their way to be productive in a positive way. This is a very optimistic thing.
I see. Professor Gesk, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Time is so limited, I know. Thank you so much for sparing your time and giving us your very first interview on CGTN. Thank you so much. Georg Gesk, Professor of Chinese Law at Osnabrück University. When we come back, my colleague Jamie Wright's interview with renowned author and journalist Vijay Prashad on why Xinjiang is strategically important to the United States.
Making sense of the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point.
Vijay Prashad, a renowned author, journalist and political commentator, is a man who needs little introduction. His work on Xinjiang, among other things, has made headlines around the world. And I'm delighted today to welcome him to the show. So Vijay, it's a pleasure to see you.
It's nice to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
So you've often said that Xinjiang is central to the US Cold War on China. So first of all, can you talk about why and how you believe the US to be in a Cold War with China, and exactly how Xinjiang fits into all of this, please?
Well, it's interesting because about almost 15 years ago, the United States came to the realization that the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, and other big countries of the global South had basically begun to trade with each other to create a trade and development project that sidelined Europe and the United States. You know, this was partly institutionalized in the BRICS project in 2009 and partly institutionalized later in the One Belt, One Road project, or later the Belt and Road project in 2013. This is the reason why US President Obama in 2011 talked about a pivot to China. China was developing rapidly, particularly economic development, but also in technology. You know, in other words, it hadn't immediate economic benefits. China's technological developments were galloping forward. And this directly threatened the accumulation strategies in the United States. In other words, it threatened the big technology companies. And so the United States tried to put pressure on China to basically slow down its development. That's the essence of the new Cold War. It's interesting that in the second Trump administration, he has surrounded himself with people who are realists, whether it's Elrich Colby, who runs his China policy from the US Defense Department, or it's his close advisor, Peter Thiel, the billionaire technology magnate. They equally believe that the threat to the United States is not coming from Iran, it's not coming from Russia, it's coming from China. It's not a military threat. They say it's an economic threat. So to undo this economic threat, they have begun now for 15 years a pressure campaign against China, which we call the new Cold War.
Right. So we've all heard the Western narratives surrounding Xinjiang. Forced labor this, human rights violations that. There's even been claims made of genocide at the highest levels of the US government. Do you put any weight in these claims?
Well, it's interesting because the United States government began a very, very major military campaign in 2001, which it called the War on Terror. First, the United States, with its European allies, attacked Afghanistan, killed unknown numbers of people. We really don't know the body count from Afghanistan. Then the United States illegally attacked Iraq without a UN Security Council mandate. Million people plus, more than 1 million people died in the US illegal war in Iraq. And then, this war on terror spread all across the world. There were dark site prisons in Poland and we don't know where, in Guantanamo Bay and so on. United States government was picking up people off the streets of Italy and disappearing them. It was a very vicious campaign, which, included the destruction of Libya in 2011. This is actually real. This actually happened, and there's been no accountability. The US actually illegally attacked Iraq. There's no need to take my word for it. UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said so to BBC in 2004. He said this war is illegal that the US is prosecuting in Iraq. These things actually happened. Millions of Muslims were killed in these wars of terror conducted by the United States. This is real life, yeah? So it was interesting that as part of the new Cold War pressure on China, that the United States, which had conducted this war on terror in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, in Pakistan, and so on, United States suddenly became a defender of Muslims. That was itself a surprise. And then to make allegations about things that it said were happening in Xinjiang, which didn't ever come to the level of the war in Iraq, for instance, over 1 million people dead. Not one US document suggests that 1 million people were killed in Xinjiang, not one US document. So what they did actually in real life in Iraq, they sort of transposed in a fabricated way to what was happening in Xinjiang. Now look, let's be quite clear. In the region of Central Asia, from the 1990s onward, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a serious problem with the rise of a kind of militancy, of terrorism, a serious problem in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan. So did China. There were terrorist attacks in Urumqi. They wanted to deal with the issue of terrorism in a manner that was sustainable and long-term, not just a military manner, but through economic development. And the United States is arguing, in a sense, Jamie, and this is what's interesting, that its strategy of killing over 1 million people is somehow more legitimate than economic development. They are calling economic development genocide and worrying about what they call cultural genocide, when they are actually inflicting the disappearance of Iraqi people and right now defending completely with complicity the actual genocide of the Palestinians.
We'll get into the genocide that is taking place right now and the claims of genocide that were made against in Xinjiang. But first, I think it's interesting you mentioned about the US's the war on terror, the 20-year plus invasion and occupation of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Now, it's kind of interesting that the same politicians who were leading these wars are now attempting to position themselves as the defenders of human rights, those that care about Muslims in Xinjiang. What's your take?
See, it's interesting. The politicians who do this kind of thing, who do this, they need to go and sit on the couch of a Freudian analyst to try to understand their attempt to transpose their own problems onto somebody else. Okay, they actually participated in the creating of dark sites, prisons, Guantanamo Bay, and so on. They actually participated in this. They supported it. They waved the flag in favor of it. You know, the prisons in Bagram, in Afghanistan, or in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. People have forgotten the name Abu Ghraib. These are real prisons which the United States set up to torture people and so on. They then suddenly came up with these reports in the early period of the new Cold War against China to make accusations saying China is doing this in Xinjiang. Now, the evidence for it is so light when one reads those texts. The evidence is light. Now, obviously, something was happening in Xinjiang. Why do we know that? Because the Chinese government, like again the governments of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so on, was trying to deal with an imminent problem. When I was reporting the war in Syria, I met some of the people who were far extremist organizations from the Xinjiang area in Syria. That's the headquarters. It was in Idlib province in Syria. I mean, this is a problem that a government would have to deal with. An organization that believes it's okay to blow up bombs in the center of a civilian area in Urumqi Bazaar and so on. You have to deal with these organizations. You can't be idealists and say they don't exist. They actually exist. But how you deal with them is important. And in a sense, the Chinese position has not been aerial bombardment of Urumqi. China hasn't decided, well, let's destroy the whole central bazaar. It has said that the way to tackle terrorism is through a long-term sustainable process of economic development. And on the one side, you've got to have a process of de-radicalizing people. That's the position. It's a position of peaceful tackling of terrorism, by and large. Much better than going to war against the whole civilization.
Do you think that's why it's all gone quiet on the Western Front in terms of Xinjiang? Because it's hard to make the case of a genocide happening there when there's no armed conflict, there's no bombings, and that yet the world can see every day the pictures of destruction, of famine, of death coming out every day. So is that why we're no longer hearing about the Xinjiang genocide?
Well, let's think about what a genocide is. A genocide is the complete destruction either of a people or of their culture. That's you got to somehow prove that you don't have to kill everybody in a people, but you have to kill a lot of people. So that was not possible to be made. I mean, there simply isn't mass killing happening in Xinjiang. Well, you could say, okay, no mass killing. What about mass displacement of people? Cleansing of people, like what's happening in Gaza, the attempt to remove all the Palestinians from there. Well, there's no evidence of bulldozers coming in and removing the homes of the Uyghur minority and throwing them into any other country and so on. They're not being pushed into Afghanistan or Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. It's just not happening. Yeah. So there's no evidence of that. So then you fall to the third proposition on genocide, which is cultural genocide, saying that, the Uyghur people's culture is being removed. Well, how do you measure that? That is actually a very difficult thing to have a standard for. You say, well, people who are non-Uyghur are moving into this area. That happens all over the world. If that is the standard for genocide, then there is genocide happening everywhere in the world where there's migration, and particularly in migration. You would say, well, in that case, the United States is a country of genocide, because where are the Native Americans? And what about that? Let's start talking about that again. That's not foundational. So then we come to the issue of economic benefit. Okay, this is interesting. Yes, it's true. There's going to be a lot of expenditure on Xinjiang. There's a major land port created near Urumqi. Xinjiang has the largest solar farm. There's an attempt to upgrade the textile industry in Xinjiang, because it's a major producer of cotton, but the textile industry was in the eastern coast. There's an attempt to move the textile industry into southern Xinjiang. All of that is happening. So the question is raised, who's benefiting? Are the Uyghur minority benefiting from this? If you start asking those questions, Jamie, then you have to ask the questions of any economic development. Who's benefiting? If there's a mining company from Canada operating in Zambia, are the Zambian people benefiting? Yeah, that's now going to be questions about capitalism. Well, actually, interestingly, let's stay on this issue of economic development and benefits. In fact, it's interesting. If you look at the statistics, it looks like the benefits have gone quite broadly to the population in Xinjiang. Xinjiang has had a very successful poverty alleviation campaign. Xinjiang has been very successful in lifting up its economic status in the country. It's one of the fastest growing regions for incomes and so on. So where is the evidence of a genocide? Okay, then you say the de-radicalization project is a problem. Well, look, firstly, they are not dead. The people who were being, taught about a gentler form of Islam and so on, they were not being killed off they were not, children thrown in camps and just made to spend their life there like the United States did in Guantanamo. I mean, there are places where people are being taught this is a gentler form of Islam. This is, not a good interpretation. That's a legitimate form of debate and discussion for any government to have. Okay. Now, you may not agree with their interpretation of Islam or whatnot. Have a debate and discussion. That's open. But to call that a genocide, I think is going very far, because if that is a genocide and you're not willing to call what's happening in Palestine a genocide, then we've got a problem with the English language.
I think we're out of time. Vijay, I could talk about this all day with you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
With that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.